The first thing Darrow noticed about the planet was that it smelled like home. Not home as it was now, stripped, dust-choked, thigh scaharavau prime gone the awe of a bruise. But home as it had been when he was a child, when his mother still kept a garden behind the house, and the air off the river carried something green and living. He stood in the wreckage of the Kalon's mid-section and breathed it in without meaning to. And for 3 seconds he forgot that his ship was in 2 pieces, and that everyone he'd been paid to transport across the Vareth corridor was dead. Then the smoke reached him, and he remembered. The crash sequence had lasted 11 minutes. He knew because he'd been counting. When the asteroid field tore through the Kalon's sensor shroud and punched the first rock through the forward hull, Darrow had done everything the manual said to do, and a few things it didn't, and it hadn't mattered at all. The ship had come apart on descent like a cracked egg. The rear section, the one carrying the 62 passengers in their cryosleeves, had hit the canopy first. He didn't need to hike out there to know what that looked like. He sat on the lip of the broken hull for a long time. His sidearm was in his hand. He turned it over once, then set it on the metal beside him. He pulled out the personal unit from his breast pocket instead. The screen was cracked at the corner, but it came on, and there was Sen's face. His wife, recorded 3 months ago before he left, telling him to come home safe. Behind her in the doorway, he could see Riz making a face at the camera, 14 years old, and already too old for sentiment, or pretending to be, his daughter. The reason he'd taken this contract. The reason he was sitting on a dead ship on an unknown planet with 62 corpses behind him and a broken sidearm at his hip instead of sitting in the kitchen eating his wife's terrible soup. He put the unit away. He had already decided to die when the sound reached him. It came from the cargo section, a thin, high noise, almost a word. He ignored it. Then it came again, and this time there was no mistaking it. A child, somewhere under the wreckage, still alive. Her name was in the manifest as Yara. She was 8, maybe 9, traveling alone, listed as passenger 44. Her cryo sleeve had been shielded from the impact by a structural beam that had come down like a bridge across the chamber. And she had woken up into the smoke, and the dim green light, and the sound of something very large moving in the jungle outside. She didn't speak his dialect. She spoke the eastern tongue of Vel Prime, the inland register, the one his grandmother had used. He spoke it badly. They stared at each other for a long moment in the wreck of the ship, this man and this child, and the jungle breathed around them. He showed her the map on his wrist unit, pointed to the red dot 14 kilometers north, where the Kalon's emergency ascent pod had come down on the high ridge. Intact, according to the distress ping it was still transmitting. He pointed to it. He pointed to her. He pointed to himself. He mimed walking with 2 fingers. She watched him with enormous dark eyes and said nothing. He gave her a nutrient bar from his kit. She ate it very quickly, the way children eat when they've been afraid. Then she nodded once. And that was that. They went into the world. The first thing the planet taught them was patience. You moved slowly or you moved wrong. The undergrowth was dense as a wall, full of sound, clicks and calls, and a low subsonic hum that Darrow could feel in his back teeth more than hear. And the light filtered down in long cathedral shafts that made everything look holy and dangerous at once. The soil was dark and soft and held footprints. It held other things too. The track he found on the second hour was wider than his handspan, 3-toed, pressed a centimeter into the mud. He crouched over it and said nothing. Yara came and stood beside him. She looked at the track. She looked at him. He stood up and kept walking. He had a rifle, a survey-grade pulse model, not a combat weapon. 14 charges in the cell. He counted them twice. He kept it across his body with the safety off, which was not how you were supposed to carry it, and he decided not to care. By the 3rd hour, Yara had started trying to talk to him. She used words he didn't know and watched his face to see if they landed. When they didn't, she tried different ones. She pointed at things. A flower the size of his fist, a bird that wasn't quite a bird, a pool of water that smelled of sulfur, and told him their names in her language, waiting patiently while he repeated them badly. He didn't know why she was doing it. Maybe she just needed to hear herself talk. Maybe she understood, in some instinctive child logic, that the silence between them was a kind of distance she couldn't afford. He let her talk. He kept his eyes on the canopy. On the 4th hour, the planet showed them what it was. They heard it before they saw it. A percussion of snapped branches, rhythmic and heavy, something large moving through the middle distance to their east, with complete indifference to concealment. Darrow put his hand on Yara's shoulder, and they stopped. The sound continued. Then, through a gap in the trees it passed, a shape so large it reorganized his sense of scale, moving on two legs with a terrible fluid power, the small forelimbs tucked close to the chest. It didn't look at them. It was 40 meters away, and it didn't know they existed. It went on. Yara's hand found his. Her fingers were very cold. He squeezed once and let go, and they walked on. The language between them built the way all languages do, slowly, then suddenly. By the end of the first day, they had 20 words in common. By the second, 40. She learned the Verith words for stop, go, quiet, run, and danger, and he learned her words for tree, water, afraid, and okay. Okay was the one they used most. She would look at him and say it, the Eastern word, tilted up at the end into a question. And he would say it back, flat, which meant yes. They got very good at this. On the second day, they found water, and then immediately found trouble. The creature came out of the river on his blind side. Low to the ground, quick, a thing like a scaled dog but longer, its neck weaving side to side in a way that suggested it was tracking by scent. He shot it at 7 meters. The pulse blew it sideways, and it screamed and thrashed and went still. His hands were shaking. He checked. 13 charges. Yara had not run. She had pressed herself against a tree with both hands flat against the bark and watched him shoot the creature. And when it was over, she peeled herself off the tree and came and stood beside the body and looked at it for a long moment, with an expression he couldn't read. Then she looked at him and said something in her language that he didn't have a word for yet. That night he made them a shelter from a fallen section of hull plating he'd dragged from the crash. It had taken 2 hours, and built a small fire against the inside wall, and they ate the last of the kit rations, and he showed her the map again, tracing the route with his finger. 14 kilometers, he said in Varith. She repeated it. 14. She pointed at the red dot. Home, she said. The Eastern word, the one that meant home in the broadest sense. Not just a building, but a place of return. He looked at her. He thought about Sen's face on the cracked screen. He thought about Riz making faces at the camera. Not home, he said, but away from here. On the third day, they found the cave system, and the cave system tried to kill them. It started as shelter. A long limestone gallery running roughly north, which matched their heading, and would save them 2 kilometers of exposed ridgeline. The first few hundred meters were clean. Then the floor cracked without warning, and he went through up to the knee, and when he pulled his leg free, something in the dark at the back of the gallery moved. He grabbed Yara's hand and they ran. The thing behind them was fast in the dark, in the way that things born to darkness are fast. Not reckless, but certain, and it didn't sound like the creature from the river. It sounded bigger. He could hear it breathing. He fired blind behind him twice, saw the pulse flash illuminate a shape he did not want to look at directly, kept running. They came out the other end of the gallery into daylight, and kept running another 50 meters before he let himself stop. He stood with his hands on his knees and counted charges. 11. Yara was beside him, breathing hard, and when he straightened up, she was looking at him with that expression again. The one he couldn't read, and then she reached out and pressed her hand flat against his chest, over the heart, and held it there for a moment. He didn't know what it meant in her language. He decided it meant what it would have meant in his. I know, he said. Me too. The shoulder happened late on the third day. When he came down wrong from a tree, he'd climbed to check the terrain ahead, and the joint separated with a sound like a green branch breaking. He went white with the pain and sat down in the dirt, and Yara came and stood over him with an expression on her face that was trying very hard to be calm. She'd seen him demonstrate first aid on the second day. He'd made her watch while he talked through the kit, using gestures and repetition until she understood each item. Now she picked up his arm, looked at the way it was hanging, and with a careful, deliberate pressure that was somehow worse than roughness, she put it back. He screamed once, short, into the dirt. Then he got up. The morning of the fourth day, the mountain told them the time was running out. He'd been watching the sky all journey. The arc of debris in the upper atmosphere was subtle at first, a shimmer that could have been atmospheric disturbance, and then less subtle, and now unmistakable. A ring of incoming material, large and small, beginning to catch the angle of the sun. He'd known from the moment he first triangulated their position against the star charts. He hadn't told Yara because there was nothing to tell. Either they reached the pod, or they didn't. She noticed when he did. She stopped walking and stood in a clearing and looked up at the sky for a long time. The debris shimmer was visible even in daylight now, a faint iridescent band across the upper atmosphere that was almost beautiful. She said something in her language. Then she looked at him. He didn't know the words, but he knew what she was asking. He pointed north. He held up 4 fingers. 4 hours, roughly. He pointed at the sky. He held up both hands, all 10 fingers. She watched him. He could see her doing the math that she shouldn't have been old enough to do. She nodded. She started walking. He watched her for a moment, this child, this stranger from the eastern inland provinces of a world he'd left to earn the money to save a different child. And something moved in his chest that he did not have a name for. Then he followed her. They came over the ridge in the early afternoon and saw the pod. It was down the slope, tilted at an angle against an outcrop of pale rock, its running lights still blinking green in the long shadows. He stood at the top of the ridge and looked at it, and felt a complex, exhausted thing that was not quite relief. Yara said his name. She'd started calling him Daro on the second day. The Vareth word approximated through her accent into something that sounded like a new word entirely, and pointed down the slope and looked at him. Yes, he said. Yes, they were 60 meters from the pod when the world heard them coming. The first one came from the tree line to the east, enormous and purposeful, the ground shaking with a cadence that Daro recognized from 3 days ago, when it had passed 40 meters away, and not known they were alive. It knew now. It came out of the tree line at a run, and he shoved Yara toward the pod and turned and fired, and the pulse hit the creature in the shoulder and turned it, but didn't stop it. He fired again. Third shot broke something structural and it went down hard, thrashing, shaking the ground as it fell. He checked, 9 charges. The second one came from the north. He had 3 shots at it, before it was on top of him and all 3 hit, and it still wasn't down, and he went sideways into the dirt, and it passed over him, jaws snapping at the air where he'd been standing. He rolled, came up, fired the fourth at point-blank range into the base of its throat. It went down, 5 charges. He was bleeding from somewhere. His shoulder was screaming. He got to his feet. Yara was at the pod hatch, working the manual release, and she turned and looked at him with an expression that was asking him to come. He started toward her. Then the ground shook in a new way, a deeper register, a frequency he hadn't felt before. And the third one came. It was larger than the other 2. It was the same individual that had passed through the trees. On the first day, he was almost certain. There was a particular set to the head, a way it carried its weight. And it had been tracking them for 4 days without their knowing. It came across the slope at a speed that redefined the word. He had 5 shots, and he used them all, and the creature kept coming. When the rifle clicked empty, he threw it, which accomplished nothing, and ran. He ran toward the geyser field. He'd noted it from the ridge. 100 meters east, the ground there pale and crusted and steaming in the long afternoon light. Behind him, the creature was close enough that he could hear the exhalation of each stride. His shoulder was in flames, his lungs were in flames. He ran. He reached the geyser field and cut left along its edge, and the creature followed him onto the pale crust. And the first geyser went off 6 meters to his right, and the blast of superheated water caught the creature across the flank, and it screamed, a sound unlike any sound he had ever heard, and staggered. He cut right. Another geyser, larger, and he threaded between them by memory. He'd mapped them from the ridge. He'd spent 10 seconds looking, and he'd stored the pattern without knowing why. And the creature couldn't read the pattern, couldn't see what he'd seen, and the third geyser caught it full, and it went down. He stopped. His heart was somewhere in his skull. He stood on the pale crust with steam rising around him and looked at the creature on the ground, and it was still trying to rise, still trying, and then Yara was beside him. She'd come out of the pod, she'd come after him, and she was holding something. A piece of bone sharpened to a point, the tip dark with something she'd prepared days ago from the toxic berries they'd found on the second day, which she'd kept because she was 8 years old and had been paying attention. She drove it into the creature's neck with both hands and all her weight, and stood over it until it was done. She looked at him. She was breathing hard and her arms were shaking, and she looked at him the way Riz had looked at him once, after a bad storm on a camping trip, when she'd been 12 and scared, and pretending she wasn't. That specific look. He had no idea how it had traveled 40 light years and 4 days through a dying forest to reach him, but there it was. Come on, he said. In Vareth, which he almost understood by now, she came. Inside the pod, he got the systems up, and the distress beacon responded. A rescue vessel in the outer system, 3 days out, already locked to their coordinate. The asteroid ring was thickening visibly now. Through the forward port, the debris spreading down through the atmosphere in long burning threads, and the sky to the east was going the color of old copper. He ran the launch sequence. Yara strapped into the co-pilot harness and watched his hands on the controls with the focused, memorizing attention she gave to everything. He thought about leaving a log. Something for the record. Some account of the planet, and what lived on it, and what it looked like in the long afternoon, with the light coming through the trees. He decided against it. There would be no one to send it to who would understand. The pod broke atmosphere at 1400 and something hours, local time. Below them, the world ended. It was not a small ending. The asteroid hit in a chain, half a dozen major impactors across a range of thousands of kilometers, and the light was extraordinary. He watched through the rear port for a moment. A planet that had no idea it was about to be made into a museum, into a memory, into the foundation of something that wouldn't exist for 65 million years. The largest predators he'd ever seen, dying in a light they couldn't have named. He thought, that was their world. We were the aliens there. Yara touched his arm. She pointed at the rescue vessel coordinate on the screen and looked at him with the Eastern word that meant both question and confirmation at once. Yes, he said, that's where we're going. He reached into his breast pocket and took out the personal unit. The screen was cracked and the corner was dark, but Seni's face came on anyway mid-sentence, telling him to come home safe. Behind her in the doorway, Riz in the middle of a face. He turned the screen so Yara could see. Yara looked at the image for a long time. Then she looked at him. She said the Eastern word for daughter, which he'd learned on the second day, and tilted it up into a question. He shook his head once. He put the unit away. He settled back into the pilot seat. His shoulder ached with a steady, deep fire, and there was dried blood on his left hand, and his mouth tasted like the copper-colored sky they'd left behind. And he was, as far as he could tell, alive. Outside, the stars were very close. Yara reached across the console and put her hand flat on his forearm, the same gesture she'd made on the third day, the one he'd decided meant what it would have meant in his language. She held it there for a moment, said the Eastern word for okay, and waited. He put his hand over hers. Okay, he said. His voice came out rougher than he'd intended. Okay. The rescue vessel's running lights appeared in the forward port, small and white and steady, and they flew toward them through the dark between stars. The two of them, a pilot from a dying world and a child who'd kept a poisoned spear for 4 days, because she'd been paying attention, and neither of them spoke, because they had already said everything that mattered, in a language they had made together out of nothing, on a planet that was already becoming a fossil record, 65 million years before anyone would think to look.